Red Hill Pass, Colorado, August 1943. The cold cut into my lungs like broken glass. Even in August the wind here bit hard, sliding down from the high rock faces and into the pass. Smoke drifted from the burned-out trucks on the roadside, thin, gray ribbons twisting in the air, as if the mountains themselves were exhaling. I knelt with the others, hands clasped behind my neck, wrists shaking not from fear but from the weakness that comes when a man has eaten too little for too long. My last real meal had been 4 days earlier, somewhere south of Salerno, before the counterattack broke and the Americans overran our position. An engine growled. Tires scraped over gravel. An American truck pulled to a halt in front of us, brakes screaming in protest. The G***ner stood in the back, silhouetted against the pale sky. On your feet. Welcome to Red Hill. I rose slowly. My legs quivered. The air smelled of dust, diesel, and distance, and then something else. Something impossible. Meat. Real meat. Through the thin mountain mist I saw a long wooden building farther up the slope. Steam curled from metal vents along its roof, rolling lazily into the wind. I stared at it as if it were a mirage. Why bring us here? Why bring starving prisoners to a place that smelled like a feast? I did not understand. And that frightened me more than hunger ever had. Red Hill lay higher than any place I had ever stood. The pass cut through the mountains like a wound, its slopes bare, its soil thin and red as if stained by old iron. The American guards marched us upward in a slow, deliberate line. None of us spoke. Breath drifted in pale ribbons from our mouths, dissolving in the cold air. They led us through a gate of timber posts and barbed wire. The camp beyond was orderly in a way that unsettled me, straight rows of barracks, a tall water tower humming with pressure, a generator house pulsing with the faint rhythm of engines. Everything here worked. Everything here was precise. It felt more like an installation than a prison. A sign near the entrance read, Red Hill POW Camp, U.S. Army. Below it, another plaque displayed a set of rules in English. I caught only fragments, but one line, repeated twice, held my gaze. POWs shall receive rations equal to U.S. garrison troops. I thought I had misread it. Rations equal to soldiers? It contradicted every expectation a captured man carried with him. In Africa, we had eaten from tins dented by heat. In Italy, before my capture, we lived on thin soups that tasted of boiled water and discipline. The idea that prisoners should be fed like the men who guarded them was not simply rare, it was unimaginable. Inside the camp, the smell grew stronger, fat rendered in heat, broth simmering behind closed doors, something sweet carried by the wind. The odor confused my senses. Hunger sharpened sound and smell until both became almost painful. One of the guards, a tall man with a square jaw and calm eyes, walked alongside us. His rifle hung in a relaxed sling. He spoke to no one. When our column slowed near the mess hall, he glanced toward the building as if to confirm something. Whatever he saw satisfied him. He nodded once, almost to himself, then continued guiding us forward. We reached a small parade ground where another officer waited. His clipboard was tucked beneath one arm. He wore thick gloves, a wool coat, and an expression of mild impatience, as though processing 50 ragged prisoners were simply another administrative task before lunch. Regulation 3321, he announced in a clear voice, requires that prisoners under U.S. custody receive 3,000 calories per day, including meat and fresh vegetables. Fresh vegetables. I felt the words more than heard them. They settled inside my mind like an echo from another world. The officer continued speaking, explaining schedules, latrine rules, work assignments. None of us responded. We were too tired, too hollowed. But his tone was the tone of a man reading a manual, firm, procedural, untroubled. If he noticed our disbelief, he ignored it. Behind him, steam billowed from the mess hall vents. A metal door opened as a cook stepped out carrying a tray. I saw a spill of color, orange, green, brown. He scraped leftovers into a bin, closed the lid, and returned inside. Leftovers. My throat tightened. The idea of food discarded casually, not from rot or contamination but from abundance, struck me with a force greater than any blow. Abundance was a concept that belonged to stories told by children or propaganda broadcasts. It had no place in a prison camp carved into a mountain pass. And yet the evidence clung to the air itself. Meat. Butter. Vegetables. Scents that belonged to men who were not starving. We stood there in silence, unsteady on our feet, and I realized something with slow, cold clarity. The Americans had built a world here governed not by fear or scarcity but by rules written far away, rules that demanded generosity even toward their enemies. It was the first contradiction of Red Hill, and it would not be the last. Before the war, my world was smaller than any map the army ever issued. A single valley in Upper Bavaria, a mill beside a narrow river, and the steady rhythm of stones turning grain into flour. That was my life. My father ran the mill with a patience I once mistook for stubbornness. He said a man should understand the thing that feeds him, and grain was the one constant he trusted. Work, then bread, then work again. Nothing wasted. I grew up in that narrow room above the grinding wheels. The dust was always in the air, a pale haze that settled on our clothes, our hair, our days. By the time I was 12, I could lift a sack of rye to my shoulder and carry it from cart to chute without pause. My father watched but never praised. He believed work spoke for itself. Praise, like food, had to be earned. He taught me to judge grain by sound as well as weight. Listen, he would say, letting the kernels fall through his fingers. A full harvest has its own voice. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Later I learned he was right. Hunger had a sound too, thinner, harsher, almost brittle. My younger sister, Lotte, was the only softness in that house. She wrote letters filled with questions about places neither of us would ever see. Before the war swallowed everything, she sent me a small note torn from a school notebook. In it she had drawn a crooked heart and written, "If you ever can, bring me a piece of chocolate." I kept the paper folded in my pocket. It traveled with me from Bavaria to Africa, then to Italy, and finally here, to this mountain pass in a country I had only known from geography books. People imagined soldiers beginning as warriors. I did not. I was a mill apprentice who could fix a jammed chute, tune a grinding stone, or judge precisely how much water the wheel needed to keep the gears from seizing. Those habits followed me into the army. When others cursed their rations, I studied them. When men argued about supplies, I counted them. Hunger was not theory to me, it was the weight of a half-empty sack carried uphill. In North Africa, during the long months when supply convoys failed to reach us, I learned again what my father had tried to teach: food is not magic. It is labor, distance, weather, storage, discipline. I watched trucks arrive half-filled, tins dented, bread already stale. I saw the hollow look in men who had marched too long on too little. I felt it too. By the time we reached Italy, I could sense scarcity the way some men sensed approaching rain. The officers spoke of strategy. I thought of calories, of men burning themselves down to bone. When our unit was finally surrounded near Salerno, there was no dramatic stand, no noble last effort. We were simply too tired. Our bodies had been spent long before the battle began. When I was captured, the Americans catalogued me with the others: name, rank, unit. None of that felt real anymore. The only truth I carried was the memory of the mill, the rhythm of grain falling, and my father's voice saying that work and food were inseparable. That memory stayed with me as they marched us into Red Hill. It was the one piece of home untouched by the war, and the only measure I had left to understand the strange abundance that awaited us, an abundance so complete it felt like a story told by someone who had never known hunger. I walked into captivity not as a soldier defeated, but as a miller's son who understood the weight of every loaf. When the guards marched us toward the mess hall, I expected another inspection, another queue, another disappointment shaped like a meal. Hunger teaches a man to expect nothing. It hardens the mind against hope. And yet as we approached the long wooden building, the smell thickened: beef, onions, something warm and sweet beneath it. My stomach tightened as if bracing for a blow. The door opened. A burst of heat rolled out, carrying steam and the soft clatter of metal trays. I stepped inside and stopped. The others behind me collided in a clumsy line, but I did not move. I could not. The tables were already set. Not bowls of thin broth or pieces of hard crust, but full trays, dense, substantial, almost excessive. I saw beef stew, its surface shimmering with fat. Beside it, mashed potatoes arranged in careful mounds, a square of cornbread still glistening with moisture, green beans bright as if picked that morning, and, at the far edge of the tray, a slice of berry pie the color of dusk. I thought it was a display meant to deceive us, something staged for inspection. My first instinct was that half the portion would be taken away once we sat down. My second was that the trays were for officers only. My third was that we were not meant to eat at all, that this was some elaborate misunderstanding and the real meal would appear later, smaller and harder. Around me, the men whispered. "They will change it," one muttered. "It is a trick," another insisted. "For the guards, not for us." I shared their certainty. Reality does not transform because a door opens. Not for prisoners. Then I saw them, American soldiers seated at a parallel row of tables, eating the same portions from the same trays. They ate slowly, without vigilance or ceremony. For them, this abundance was ordinary, even unremarkable. They did not guard their plates. They did not measure each bite as if it might be the last. They simply ate. An American sergeant stepped forward and motioned to the empty benches. "Find a seat. Trays are served at the counter. No pushing. No pushing." He said it the way a man warns children not to run near a staircase. We moved cautiously, each step betraying suspicion. I held my tray with both hands as if it might collapse under its own weight. At the counter, cooks ladled stew in heavy portions that made the metal tremble. One placed a pat of butter on my potatoes. Another added the pie with a nod. It felt wrong. Not immoral, impossible. I carried the tray to a bench and sat with deliberate slowness. The heat rising from the food washed against my face. My fingers hovered over the stew. I did not taste it at first. I simply stared. Across from me, a young prisoner murmured, "This cannot last." His voice was brittle, sharp at the edges. "It will shrink tomorrow. Watch. They will reduce it. They must." I believed him. I believed all of it. Scarcity was the rule we understood, abundance was a mistake waiting to be corrected. But as I finally lifted the first spoonful, thick, savory, rich enough to sting my throat with memory, I felt something else beneath the disbelief. Fear. Not of the Americans, not of captivity, but of the quiet possibility that everything I knew about hunger, effort, and worth had met its first contradiction at a wooden table in a mountain pass. The shock of that first meal did not fade overnight. It stayed with us like an ache, pleasant, terrifying, unfamiliar. Some men ate slowly, suspicious of every bite. Others devoured their food as if speed alone could save it from vanishing. By morning, the unease had settled into our bones. Abundance was not comfort, it was threat. Anything so generous could be taken away without warning. Before dawn, the cold returned with its usual indifference. The barracks creaked as men rose for roll call. I felt the heaviness in my limbs, not exhaustion, but the weight of food my body no longer knew how to carry. Then, minutes before the bell, someone collapsed outside. A dull thud, a cry, boots scraping on frozen dirt. When we rushed out, we saw him, a thin infantryman from Bremen, unconscious, his face pale, breath shallow. He had eaten too much, too quickly. His body, starved for months, could not reconcile the sudden richness. 5 more fell before noon. The Americans acted with orderly urgency. A medic knelt beside each man, checking pulse, lifting eyelids, taking notes with clinical calm. The mess officer, Lieutenant Stevens, arrived soon after. He was a tall man with a clipboard always tucked under his arm, as if it were part of his uniform. He spoke briefly with the doctor, who shook his head. "They need less fat, less volume, at least for a few days," the doctor said. His voice was low, professional. "If this continues, I'll be treating dozens." Stevens tightened his jaw. "Regulation says full rations. 3,000 calories. No reductions." The doctor hesitated. "Their bodies cannot handle this. They are not ready." "Orders are orders," Stevens replied, as though reciting something carved in stone. "We feed them as we feed our own." The doctor exhaled sharply but did not argue further. He returned to his patients. Stevens walked away, notes flapping in the wind. That evening, the guards patrolled with unusual focus. I sensed a tension beneath their usual discipline. Something had been reported, some suspicion growing. When I returned to my tent, I saw unfamiliar tracks in the soil, fresh and deliberate. Moments later, a guard called out sharply. "Over here." A small crowd formed. At the edge of the tent row, the ground had been disturbed. Someone had dug a shallow pit, barely covered with loose earth. The guard knelt, brushed aside the soil, and revealed the truth. Inside were hidden rations, rolls, apples, portions of beef wrapped in cloth. 17 rolls. 3 servings of meat. 4 apples. Half had already begged *n to spoil. The guard's expression tightened, not in anger but understanding. He had seen this before. Hunger made thieves of us long before capture did. One of the prisoners whispered, "They will punish us for this." Another muttered, "We must hide more. They will reduce the portions." I stared at the pit, at the hoarded food rotting in the cold earth. It struck me then, we were not starving from lack of rations. We were starving from memory, from the long months when every meal carried the threat of ending forever. The guards ordered everyone to assemble. Stevens arrived moments later, his clipboard tucked under his arm as always. He looked at the pit, then at us. "All hidden food must be surrendered," he said evenly. "Starting tonight." A murmur rippled through the ranks, thin but unmistakable: fear, resentment, the instinct to cling to what little we understood. Stevens continued, "There will be no reductions. No change in portions. Full rations will continue." His words sounded like a promise, but to men shaped by scarcity, promises meant nothing. Scarcity had rules. Hunger had certainty. And abundance, sudden, unearned, was a danger none of us could name aloud. At that moment, I realized the contradiction was no longer about food. It was about trust. And trust had no place in a camp built of wood, wire, and bewildering generosity. The order to surrender all hidden food spread through the camp like a cold wind. Men stiffened, shoulders tightening, eyes narrowing with an instinct older than discipline. Hunger had carved lessons into us that no clipboard or regulation could erase. We had survived by saving, hoarding, guarding. Now the guards demanded the opposite. As evening settled over Red Hill, a faint orange glow formed above the mess hall vents. The smell of dinner drifted across the yard, meat frying, onions softening, bread warming on metal trays. For many, it only deepened the fear. Abundance still felt like a mistake waiting to vanish. When the guards stepped forward to collect the hidden food, resistance was not open, but silent. Men avoided their eyes. Some lied without speaking, simply by standing still. Others waited for someone else to speak first. A few stared at the ground, lips pressed thin, the shame of being discovered heavier than the rations themselves. I felt the tension like a rising current. Stevens stood near the pit where the guards had placed everything they had dug up that day. His expression was unreadable. He was a man who carried his orders the way others carried we*P*NS, firmly, without sentiment. "Any additional items must be turned in," he said. "Tonight." No one moved. The silence grew sharp. I felt something then, not courage, exactly, but a pressure that had nowhere left to go. The pit, half filled with spoiled bread and meat, seemed to accuse both sides, the Americans for offering too much, us for trusting too little. Before I understood what I was doing, I stepped forward. "Lieutenant," I said. My voice cracked, curved, steadied. "We hide food because we believe it will stop. We believe this," I gestured to the mess hall, to the steam rising into the dusk, "cannot last." Several prisoners hissed warnings at me. Speaking out was foolish. Speaking to an officer was dangerous. Speaking for others was unforgivable. But the words continued. "You say rations will stay the same. But we have lived too long with shortages to trust promises. If you want us to stop hiding food, show us the supply will not end. Not by rule. By proof." The yard went still. Even the guards seemed uncertain. Stevens looked at me as if weighing whether my words were defiance or something else entirely. The clipboard hung at his side, he had stopped taking notes. A few prisoners muttered behind me. "Idiot. Traitor. He speaks for himself." I ignored them. My hands were shaking, though from what, fear, cold, memory, I could not tell. Stevens finally spoke. "You are requesting proof?" "I am asking," I said carefully, "for something we can believe." His jaw shifted, not in anger, but in thought. He wrote a brief line on his clipboard, tore the page free, and tucked it into his pocket. "Prisoner Kramer requests demonstration, not assurance," he said quietly, almost to himself. A guard beside him frowned. Prisoners were not allowed to request anything. Even less were they allowed to shape policy. Stevens dismissed the formation. "Return to your barracks. All of you." As we dispersed, I felt eyes burning into my back, some furious, some grateful, most unreadable. I had broken a rule of captivity and a rule of survival in the same breath. In the barracks, no one spoke to me at first. Then a man whispered from the dark. "If they punish us, it is your fault." Another voice answered. "If they listen, it is also his doing." I lay awake long after lights out, hearing the wind scrape against the walls, wondering which outcome the morning would bring. Morning arrived with a thin frost on the ground and a silence heavier than any snowfall. The barracks stirred slowly, men dressing without words, each movement careful, as if noise alone might trigger a punishment none of us could predict. I felt their glances, some sharp, some hollow, some simply tired. They were waiting to see what price we would pay for what I had said. Roll call passed without incident. Stevens was present, standing near the formation with his clipboard tucked beneath one arm, but he issued no reprimand and asked no questions. His expression revealed nothing. When he gave the order to proceed to breakfast, the guards stepped aside with routine discipline. We walked toward the mess hall expecting confrontation, reduced portions, new restrictions, some visible sign of tightening control. But the trays they handed us were unchanged. Stew, potatoes, cornbread, beans, pie. The same weight. The same heat rising in gentle waves. The same impossible abundance. It was not punishment. It was not reward. It was routine. The room hummed with confusion. Men ate slowly, eyes flicking from their plates to the door, as if waiting for someone to shout that it had all been a mistake. The tension coiled through the air like wire. Then a guard entered, muttered something to the cook, and both stepped outside. A moment later he called out, "All prisoners to the yard. Now." The benches scraped. My stomach clenched. We filed out into the cold. What I saw then made the breath catch in my throat. Along the edge of the yard stood the camp's metal refuse bins, broad cylinders with hinged lids. They had been moved from behind the cookhouse and set out in full view, their lids propped open. Inside lay stacks of discarded food. Not scraps. Not bones. Leftovers. Uneaten beef. Whole rolls. Potatoes still intact. Pieces of pie crust scattered beneath them. Enough to feed dozens, carelessly thrown away. A murmur rippled through the prisoners, quiet at first, then rising like the sound of distant machinery. Stevens stepped forward. He held no clipboard now. "This is yesterday's waste," he said simply. "Every day looks like this." He did not lecture. He did not insist. He offered no threat, no promise, no argument. He only revealed the truth of the camp's supply, an excess so great that the kitchen discarded what our units in Africa would have guarded with rifles. One of the cooks lifted a ladle and let stew slide into a bucket already half full. The gesture was unremarkable. To us it was shattering. I felt something tilt inside me, not awe, not gratitude, but a slow, wrenching understanding. If a nation could feed its prisoners at this scale, if it could throw away what our frontline soldiers had marched days to obtain, then the war's outcome was no longer a matter of courage or will. It was logistics. It was capacity. It was a world built on the assumption that enough was normal. A guard near me muttered, "We feed the army. The army feeds you. If anything runs out, we order more." His tone was matter-of-fact, almost bored. I realized then that the Americans did not consider this generosity. To them, this was procedure. A system functioning as designed. Food was not magic. It was simply there. For the first time since my capture, I did not place an extra roll in my pocket. My hand stayed on the tray, empty, unsure what to hold on to now that scarcity had lost its certainty. Around me, the others stared into the bins as if looking into another world, one that existed alongside ours, unreachable until now. The breakthrough was not a decision or a declaration. It was a silent, undeniable fact. We had believed hunger was permanent. But here, it was not even deliberate. It was merely the absence of abundance. In the days that followed, the camp did not change. The meals remained steady, the portions constant. The garbage bins, those strange monuments to abundance, continued to fill with food the cooks deemed unfit to save but perfectly edible to men who had marched through scarcity. Each morning they appeared in the same place, lids open, steam rising faintly in the cool mountain air. The prisoners changed instead. Some watched the bins with suspicion, convinced the display was a trick meant to soften us before harsher measures arrived. Others whispered that the Americans were playing at humiliation, flaunting what they could waste while we stood nearby with empty pockets. A few men approached me at night, their voices laced with accusation. "You should not have spoken," one said. "You made us look weak," another insisted. Now they know we doubt them. Perhaps they were right. Doubt was the one possession we all carried into captivity, and losing it felt as dangerous as losing a P*N. Trust was not a virtue among soldiers who had survived on rations and instinct. Yet despite the anger, the furtive hoarding slowed. Each evening the ground remained undisturbed. No new pits appeared behind the tents. No rolls vanished from the tables. Men still pocketed small bits, an apple, a crust, but the desperate secrecy began to fade, replaced by a cautious, uneasy watchfulness. I kept to myself. The act of speaking out had marked me in ways I felt but could not quantify. Some nods lingered a little longer. Some conversations stopped when I approached. I was neither hero nor traitor, just an inconvenient reminder of a moment when our old certainties cracked open. Stevens crossed my path only once during that week. He was inspecting one of the water pumps, glancing at pressure gauges with the same calm precision he gave to ration logs. When he turned, our eyes met briefly. He offered a small nod, not approval, not camaraderie, simply acknowledgement. A man carrying out his duty had recognized another man wrestling with his own. Later, a guard named Anderson approached me while we were assigned to wood-splitting details near the edge of the camp. He was young, broad-shouldered, with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from never having experienced true scarcity. "You know," he said, leaning on his axe, "you boys keep looking at the kitchen like it's going to run dry. But that's not how things work here." "How do they work?" I asked. He shrugged lightly. "If we're low on beef, we order beef. If flour's short, the truck brings more. Nobody wonders whether the supply will last. The supply just does." His tone held no boast. It was simply his world. For a moment I envied him, his certainty, his casual relationship with abundance. For us, food had always been a measure of distance, danger, and labor. For him, it was routine. That evening I wrote in my small diary, the one hidden beneath my mattress. They live in a place where enough is expected. We live in a place where enough is a miracle. The words unsettled me. They revealed a truth I had avoided since the day I saw the bins. If a nation could treat excess with indifference, could feed prisoners without hesitation, could discard food that would have sustained battalions on the Eastern Front, then the war we fought was already determined, not by courage or ideals, but by the ability to supply a mountain pass in Colorado without effort. Around me, the men adjusted slowly to this new reality, though few admitted it. They ate their meals more calmly. They stopped glancing toward the counters as if expecting reductions. Some even left food unfinished, an act that felt almost sacrilegious. But none of us said aloud what we sensed. Abundance had become routine. And routine had become proof. When the war ended, the Americans processed us through a final series of forms, signatures, and inspections. They returned our belts, our watches, the few personal items that had survived months of captivity. The Red Hill tray was not on any list of permitted possessions, yet when I pointed to it, Stevens only said, "If you carried it this long, you may as well take it home." His tone held neither sentiment nor indulgence. It was simply recognition of something he did not need explained. I wrapped the tray in my spare shirt and carried it through every checkpoint until Germany reappeared on the horizon like an old memory rebuilt from ash. Bavaria lay unchanged in shape but altered in everything else, fields untended, houses patched with mismatched boards, faces thinner, shoulders narrower. The war had passed through like a harvest of iron, leaving the stalk standing but the grain gone. My mother waited at the mill door, smaller than I remembered, her hair now streaked with winter. She embraced me with a force that belonged to someone who feared the moment might dissolve. Inside, the mill had grown quieter. The wheel still turned, but slowly, as if reluctant. Flour dust lingered on the rafters like the residue of better years. That evening she set a pot of thin potato soup on the table. The broth was clear, the potatoes cut into careful squares, stretched to fill 2 bowls instead of 3. She apologized before I even tasted it. "I am sorry," she whispered. "We heard stories of how prisoners were treated. I hoped you might have eaten better than this." I lifted the spoon. The soup smelled of earth, of effort, of a house doing its best with what little it had. It tasted of home. "It is enough," I told her. The English word slipped out before the German one. The syllables felt strange in my mouth. "Truly." She studied me, searching for the part of her son that still understood hunger the way our valley had taught it. She did not speak again for several minutes. Later, I unpacked my belongings in the small room above the grinding stones. At the bottom of my kit lay the tray, cold metal, dented at one corner, its surface matte from months of use. I set it on the windowsill. In the fading light it looked like an artifact from a world that should not have existed, a world where prisoners threw away food, where supply was a constant, where the fear of emptiness had no place. Over the years I kept it close. When the mill struggled, when harvests failed, when ration cards returned during the hard winters, I would rest my hand on the tray and remember the simple truth it had shown me: scarcity is not universal. It is local, historical, made by the limits of one place and the abundance of another. Lotte grew older. She married, moved to Augsburg, raised 2 daughters who knew only faint echoes of the war. I visited often. Once she asked, pointing at the metal tray I still carried in a canvas bag, why I had kept such a plain, battered object. "It reminded me," I said, "that the world is larger than the valley we were born into. In time I told her the full story, the rations, the bins of discarded food, the quiet dignity of men who enforced rules written far from hunger. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded once, as if the picture had finally come into focus. Years later, when my hands shook too much to work the mill, a historian from Colorado wrote to me. He had visited the site of Red Hill, now long dismantled. He asked whether I still possessed anything from the camp. I sent him the tray wrapped in brown paper, along with a brief note. He replied months later, it would be displayed in a small museum near the old pass, beneath a plaque explaining its place in the strange geography of that war. It is there now, I am told, a simple metal rectangle resting beneath glass, the same tray that once held beef stew, potatoes, bread, and pie. A reminder that a soldier can lose a battle, lose a nation, even lose certainty itself, and still carry from captivity something more enduring than defeat. A measure of distance. A memory of plenty. A lesson carved in steel. I often think of that morning at Red Hill, the frost on the ground, the steam rising from the bins, the quiet way the guards went about their work. No speeches, no triumph. Just a system that fed its prisoners with the same indifference it fed its soldiers. I broke the rules because hunger had trained me to expect the worst. Yet in breaking them, I learned a truth the war had hidden: strength is not always measured in rifles or steel. Sometimes it is measured in what a nation can place on a plate without hesitation. I left Germany with scars and silence, but with one certainty I had not possessed before. America had won long before I arrived. Not with fire, but with food.